The whole court bent like wheat in a wind, and one woman did not. It was the Feast of the Harvest Moon, the first great audience the new king had held since the old king was laid in the crypt below the cathedral, and the long hall of the palace at Avonwold was lit by 300 candles and the breath of 700 people who had all learned the same lesson in the same cradle. When the king passed, you bowed. You bowed if you were a duke with land in 4 counties. You bowed if you were a scullery maid permitted to watch from the gallery. The bow was older than any of them, older than the stone of the hall, and it ran through the crowd that night like a wave through standing grain, each row folding as the young king walked the blue carpet toward his father's throne. She stood at the very edge of the crowd, near the servants' door, in a gown that had once been gray and was now the color of old ash. Her name was Mirren, though no one in that hall knew it, and she had come for the bread they gave out to the poor at the harvest audience and for nothing else. She was perhaps 26, thin in the way that hunger makes a person thin, with hands chapped raw at the knuckles and a shawl mended so many times it had become more thread than wool. She had not eaten since the morning before, and when the king passed within 10 feet of her, close enough that she could see the gold thread at his collar and the tired set of his mouth, she did not bow. She did not bow, and the people around her saw it. And the silence that opened around her was the loudest thing in the hall. Stay with me, because what the king did next is the reason this story was told for 100 years after, in kitchens and in great houses, both. He stopped. The king stopped on the blue carpet with the throne still 20 paces ahead of him, and he turned, and he looked at the one figure in 700 who was looking back at him. He was a young man, newly crowned, with his father 3 weeks in the ground, and the whole weight of a kingdom settling onto shoulders that had not yet learned the shape of it. His name was Aldous, and he was the Duke of Caldmere before the crown came to him, and he had spent his whole life being bowed to, and had never once, until that moment, been seen. What Mirren did not know, what no one in the hall knew, was that the king had buried more than a father that month. He had buried a question he could not stop asking, and the woman who would not bow was about to ask it aloud. The chamberlain moved first. He was a tall man named Lord Petrel, the keeper of the household, and he had served the old king for 30 years, and knew exactly what a court was for. He stepped toward Mirren, with his staff of office held crosswise, the way a man holds a thing he means to use, and his voice carried the way a trained voice carries, so that the whole hall heard it. "You will kneel," he said, "or you will be removed." Mirren looked at him. She did not kneel. The shawl slipped from one shoulder, and she did not move to fix it. Around her the nearest courtiers drew back as though her refusal were a thing that might be catching, and one woman in pale blue silk lifted a fan to her mouth and said, behind it but not quietly, "Some gutter creature wandered in for the bread. Look at her. She does not even know what she is." That was the first time the label was spoken. Gutter creature. It moved through the front rows in a low hiss, passed hand to hand like a coin, and Mirren heard every syllable of it. Her face did not change. Her right hand, hidden in the folds of the ash-gray gown, closed slowly into a fist, and the knuckles whitened, and that was the only place in her whole body where the thing she felt was permitted to show. The king raised one hand, and the chamberlain stopped. "Leave her," the king said. He crossed the distance himself. He came off the blue carpet, which a king was not supposed to do at a formal audience, and the gasp that ran through the hall was a small sound but a real one. The sound of 700 people watching a rule break in front of them. He stopped an arm's length from her. Up close, he was younger than the throne made him look, and there was a gray tiredness under his eyes that no amount of gold thread could hide, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud at all. It was the voice of a man asking a question he genuinely did not know the answer to. "Everyone bows," he said. "Why will you not?" The hall held its breath to hear her answer. And Mirren, who had not spoken a word since she entered, looked up into the face of the man who could have had her thrown into the street or into a cell, and she told him the truth. "Because the last time I bowed to a king," she said, "he took everything I had, and I swore I would never bend my neck to a crown again." To understand why she said it, and why the saying of it did not end with her in chains, you have to go back 6 years to a manor house in the green hills of the Vale of Estbury, where a girl named Mirren had once worn gowns the color of spring and had never in her life gone hungry. Her father had been Sir Edmund of Estbury, a knight with a small estate and a large heart, and Mirren had been his only child. It was 40 acres of good barley land, a stone house with a slate roof, an orchard her mother had planted before she died, and the right, granted by the old king's own grandfather, to hold the land free of any lord's claim so long as the family served the crown in war. Her father had served. He had ridden to the northern border in the king's name when Mirren was 19, and he had not come home, and the letter that came instead said only that he had died with honor at a river crossing whose name Mirren had never been able to forget. She had grieved him. She had also, being practical, understood that the estate was now hers, and she had gone on managing it as she had managed it during his long absences, keeping the accounts in her own neat hand, settling the tenants' disputes, seeing the barley in and the rents fair. For 1 year she had managed, and the land had prospered under her, and she had begun to believe that a woman might hold a thing and keep it. Then the king's man came. Not the old king himself, but his cousin, a lord named Vance, who held the wardship of the Western Vales. And Lord Vance looked at the 40 acres of Estbury and the stone house with the slate roof, and he saw a thing standing unprotected. He produced a document. It said that the grant of free tenure had lapsed with the knight's death, that a woman could not perform the war service the grant required, and that the land therefore reverted to the crown, which had graciously bestowed it upon him. The document had the old king's seal upon it. Mirren had ridden 3 days to the capital to protest it, and she had knelt in this very hall, on this very blue carpet, before the old king, and she had bowed her head and begged for justice. The old king had not even looked up from the dish of candied figs at his elbow. He had waved one ringed hand and said the matter was settled, and a guard had taken her arm and walked her out. And that had been the end of 40 acres of good barley land and a stone house with a slate roof and an orchard her dead mother had planted. She had bowed. She had bowed all the way to the floor, and bowing had bought her nothing but the long road back to a home that was no longer hers, where his men were already carrying her father's books out into the yard. The years after had taught her the rest of the lesson. She had gone first to her father's old comrades, the men who had ridden north with him, and found that a knight's friends are the crown's friends when the crown is the one doing the taking, and the doors that had opened to the knight's daughter closed one after another down the length of the vale. She had sold her gowns, the spring-colored gowns, one at a time, to buy bread and lodging while she petitioned and was refused, and petitioned again. She had learned which kitchens left scraps and which inns let a clean woman sleep in the stable in exchange for mending. She had learned to make herself small in doorways. And somewhere in the second winter, standing in a market square with her hand out, and her father's name, a thing she no longer spoke aloud because it shamed the memory to attach it to a beggar, she had made herself a promise that was the only property she had left. She would survive. She would not pretend the world had been just. And she would never again bend her neck to a crown, because she had done it once, all the way to the floor, and a crown had watched her do it and gone on eating figs. So when people in the great hall whispered gutter creature, they were not entirely wrong about what she had become. They were only wrong about how she had become it, and wrong about everything that mattered. The king did not know any of this yet. He knew only what she had said, and he stood there in the candlelight turning it over, and the thing that crossed his face was not anger. It was recognition. He had spent 3 weeks reading his father's papers, the private ledgers and the petitions and the judgments, and he had found in them a pattern that had kept him awake every night since the funeral. He had found land taken. He had found grants voided on technicalities and bestowed on cousins. He had found, again and again, the small, neat signatures of people who had begged and been refused, and he had begun to suspect that the kingdom he had inherited was built in part on a quiet and lawful kind of theft. He looked at Mirren as though she were a page from one of those ledgers that had stood up and begun to speak. "What is your name?" he asked Mirren. She said, "Of nowhere. I have no land for the name to sit on any more." "Sit down," the king said. It was not a kindness in the shape most people would recognize. There was a chair against the wall, a plain oak chair the footman used, and the king gestured to it as though her standing were a problem he intended to solve. She did not understand in that moment that a man who has watched a person nearly fainting from hunger will sometimes give a command instead of a comfort, because a command is the only language his rank has left him fluent in. She heard only an order from a crown, and her chin came up, and she said, "I have done enough. Sitting in halls like this. I will stand." A muscle moved in the king's jaw. He did not insist. He turned instead to the chamberlain and said in a voice meant to be heard, "Bring her food now, and a cloak." And when the chamberlain hesitated, the king said the man's name once, quietly, the way his father never had, and the chamberlain went. The court did not know what to do with any of it. A king did not feed beggars from his own table at a harvest audience. The woman in pale blue silk had lowered her fan and was watching with the particular stillness of a person recalculating where the power in a room had gone. Her name was Lady Coralie, and she was the daughter of the Earl of Marsden. And she had come to this audience for one reason, which was that her family and the late king's council had all but agreed she would be the new king's queen. She had worn the blue because someone had told her the young king favored blue. She had practiced her curtsy for a week, and now she stood forgotten 10 feet from the throne, while the king of all the realm asked a beggar woman her name. If your own neck has ever refused to bend when the whole room expected it to, you already know how Mirren felt standing there. Tell me in a comment whether you have ever paid for that refusal. Then, let me tell you what it cost her, and what in the end it bought. The food came on a silver plate, and Mirren looked at it for a long moment before she touched it. And when she did eat, she ate slowly, and with a dignity that made the watching, not the eating, the uncomfortable thing. The king did not return to his throne. He stood near her, half turned toward the hall, and he conducted the rest of the audience standing beside the servants' door, which no chronicle of Avonwold had ever recorded a king doing, and the message of it was not lost on a single soul present. Over the weeks that followed, the king did a strange thing. He did not give Mirren back her land. Not at once, because he was learning that a king who simply seizes and grants by whim is only a different kind of thief. Instead, he opened an inquiry. He summoned the old judgments and the old grants, and he installed Mirren, who could read a ledger better than any clerk in his household, in a small room off the records hall, and he set her to finding the others. The other neat signatures. The other people who had knelt and begged and been waved away over a dish of figs. She worked. She had not had work that mattered since the barley fields, and it brought a color back into her face that food alone had not. She came to the records room before the household was awake and stayed past the changing of the gate guard, and she learned the hall the way she had once learned 40 acres, by walking every row of it. The clerks resented her at first, a beggar woman set above them by the king's own hand, and the senior of them, a sour man named Hatcher, took to leaving the heaviest ledgers on the highest shelf so she would have to ask. She did not ask. She dragged the oak chair across the flags and climbed it in her mended slippers and brought the books down herself, one at a time, until Hatcher grew tired of watching a woman do silently what he had meant to make her beg for, and left the ledgers where she could reach them. She found, in those first weeks, 11 judgments she could prove were false, and she copied each one out in her own neat hand, the same hand that had kept her father's accounts, and she laid them in a row for the king to read. The king came to the records room more often than a king with a kingdom to run had any reason to. He would stand in the doorway with his hands behind his back and ask what she had found, and she would tell him, in the flat, clear voice of a woman who had stopped expecting anything from anyone, and he would listen as though her voice were the only true thing in a palace full of polished lies. He asked her once how she had learned to read a grant of tenure, a thing most lords could not do without a clerk at their elbow, and she told him her father had taught her at the kitchen table, with a tallow candle between them, because he had no son, and saw no reason a daughter could not know what a son would have known. The king was quiet a moment after that. Then he asked what her father had been like, and Mirren, who had not spoken of him to a living soul in 6 years, found she could speak of him to this one. He witnessed her worth without her knowing she was being witnessed. One gray morning, a kitchen boy of perhaps 9 had been sent to the records room with a scuttle of coal and had spilled the whole of it across the swept floor, black dust over the king's reopened judgments, and the boy had gone white, because a beating was the smallest thing a spilled scuttle could earn in that household. Mirren had knelt at once in her ash-gray gown and gathered the coal back into the scuttle with her bare hands, and she had told the boy it was nothing, that she had spilled worse, that he was to say a clerk had knocked it, if anyone asked. And she had wiped the soot from a judgment with her own sleeve, and sent him on with the half of her morning bread folded into his fist. She had not seen the king in the doorway. He had come to ask about the mill at Espery, and had stopped at the threshold, and watched a woman the whole court called gutter creature kneel in the coal dust to protect a kitchen boy who could do nothing for her in return, and he had turned and gone away without a word, and that was the morning, though neither of them marked it then, that the thing was decided in him. He never sat. She noticed that. He stood in the doorway as though crossing the threshold. Fully would be a presumption, and once, when she had been bent over a ledger for hours and the candle had burned low, he said, "Stop! Your eyes are ruining themselves. Stop and walk in the garden. The roses are still out. You command a great deal of walking and sitting and stopping," she said, not looking up. "It is the only way I know to ask," he said, and then looked as though he had not meant to say it, and left. She sat very still after he had gone. Her hand had come to rest flat on the open ledger, and her heart was doing a thing she did not approve of, a quick, uneven thing, and she pressed her palm down hard against the paper as though she could hold the feeling there and keep it from rising any higher. She was a woman who had learned what it cost to want something. She did not intend to want this. She knew exactly how it would end if she let it begin, knew it the way she knew the smell of rain before it fell, because she had read the ledgers, and she had counted the years, and she understood without bitterness that kings married for counties, and not for the women who copied out their judgments by candlelight. She had let herself want a home once. She had let herself believe a woman might hold a thing and keep it. She would not make that error twice. She bent back over the ledger and made the want into a column of figures and added it up and put it away. What she did not know was the shape of his own wound, the thing that had kept him reading ledgers at midnight, and she learned it on a gray afternoon in the records room when she found a judgment with his own hand on it. It was not the old king's signature. It was his. All this before the crown, before he was anything but a duke's heir, had signed off on the taking of a widow's mill 3 years before, on his father's instruction, without reading past the first page, because his father had told him it was a formality, and he had been young and eager to be useful. The widow had hanged herself in the mill that winter. He had learned of it only after the funeral, going through the papers, and he had carried it ever since, like a stone sewn into his coat. He told Mirren this standing in the doorway with the gray light on his face. Told it once plainly, without asking for absolution, because she had found the page, and he would not let her think the rot had run only through his father. "I did not look," he said. "I signed because I was told to. And I did not look, and a woman died because I did not look. So now, I look at everything. That is all this is." He touched his breast pocket once as he said it, a small unconscious gesture, and Mirren saw the corner of a folded paper there, soft with handling. She did not ask. She understood that some men carry their dead in their pockets so as never to forget the weight. That was the day the thing between them stopped being a king and a clerk. Neither of them named it. Yet when he turned to go, she said, "You looked at me in the hall. You were the first crowned head in my life who ever did." And he stopped in the doorway with his back to her, and he did not turn around. And after a moment he said, only, "Good night, Mirren," and the way he said her name was not the way a king says the name of a clerk. The court had been watching all of it, and the court did not like what it saw. Coralie liked it least of all. Her marriage to the king had been spoken of as settled, and now the king spent his evenings in a records room with a woman the whole palace still called the Beggar, and the earl's daughter was not a woman accustomed to being overlooked. At a dinner in the long gallery with 40 guests at the table and the king seated at its head, she made her move in the open, in the way the high-born make their moves, with a smile and a soft voice and a knife held below the cloth. "Your Majesty is so very generous to the lower orders," she said, lifting her glass, "though one does wonder. The creature you keep among the records. Was she not turned off her family's land for cause? A woman who cannot even hold what her father left her. One pities such people, of course, but one does not seat them at the table." She let her gaze travel down the long board to where Mirren sat, near the foot where the king had insisted she be placed. "Some things belong in the gutter," she said sweetly. "However one scrubs them." There it was again, the gutter. The second voicing, in the open this time before 40 witnesses, and the table went quiet the way the hall had gone quiet on the night of the harvest moon. Mirren set down her spoon. She did not flush. She had been called worse by men carrying her father's books into a muddy yard. Under the table her hand found the edge of her chair and gripped it. The king saw the gesture because by now he watched for it, and something behind his eyes went very cold and very still, like ice forming over a river. He did not defend her with a speech. That was not his way, and a speech would have made her a thing that needed defending. He simply said, into the silence, in his level voice, "Lady Coralie. Her father died holding a river crossing in my father's war. His daughter kept his accounts truer than any man in my treasury keeps mine. I find I would rather seat the gutter than the guilt." And he raised his own glass to Mirren the length of the whole table and drank. It was not the calibrated line. It was not yet. Still, it emptied the gallery of its appetite for the subject. And Coralie smiled a smile that did not reach her eyes, and said nothing more that night, and went home and wrote letters. The letters did their work. Within a fortnight, the King's Council, prompted by the Earl and several lords whose own neat signatures Mirren's inquiry had begun to uncover, presented the king with a demand dressed as advice. The kingdom needed a queen. The kingdom needed alliances. The kingdom would not tolerate the spectacle of its sovereign elevating a dispossessed woman of no family. And if His Majesty would not see reason, the council would be forced to question His Majesty's judgment in matters far beyond the records room. It was a threat, and everyone in the council chamber knew it was a threat, and it was aimed not only at the king, but at the inquiry which had begun to make a great many highly placed men afraid. The king came to the records room that night, with the gray tiredness, deeper in his face than she had ever seen it. "They will undo all of it," he said. "Every judgment I have reopened. They will say, I was led astray by a woman. And they will close the inquiry, and the land will stay with the men who took it. Unless—" He stopped. "Unless you put me out," Mirren said. She had known this was coming since the dinner in the gallery. She had been a long time learning not to hope, and the lesson held. "Unless you send me back to nowhere, and marry the blue silk, and let them keep their stolen acres. I understand. I have always understood how this ends. I knew it the day I knelt before your father. That is not what I was going to say. It is what they have told you to say. Yes." He looked at her. "It is exactly what they have told me to say. And I have come to ask you instead what you would have me do, because you are the only person in this palace who has never once told me what I wish to hear." And there it was, the dark moment, and the door swinging shut, except that he had brought her the key and laid it in her hand and asked her to choose. Mirren stood in the candlelight of the small room where she had found her work and her worth, and, though she would not say it, something more than either. And she made the costliest choice of her life. She did not ask him to keep her. She did not ask him to choose her over the crown's peace. "Finish the inquiry," she said. "Give every acre back to every family that knelt and was waved away. Do that, and let them call me whatever they like, and let them marry you to whomever they choose. I did not come back into a king's hall to gain a thing for myself. I came for bread. The work was a gift I never asked for. Do not trade the work for me. I'm not worth a single one of those families." The king was quiet for a long time. "You will not even ask," he said at last, and it was not quite a question. "I bowed once," she said. "I am done asking kings for anything." The autumn ball at Avonwold was the grandest the palace had seen since the old king's day, and the council had arranged it as a coronation of their own design, for it was to be the night the king announced his engagement to Coralie of Marsden, and the whole court came in its diamonds to watch a beggar woman put in her place by the simple fact of not being mentioned at all. Mirren was not invited. She sat in the records room with the ledgers, finishing the work, because the king had not closed the inquiry, and she did not yet know that he never would. The great hall was lit by 300 candles, as it had been on the night of the harvest moon, and the same 700 people stood on the same marble floor, and Coralie wore white and silver and stood at the king's right hand near the throne, and the earl wore the smile of a man who has won. The chamberlain struck the floor with his staff for silence. The king rose to speak. And in the gallery above, an old woman in a housekeeper's black, who had served at Estbury when Mirren was a child, and had wept to see her young mistress reduced to begging bread, leaned to the woman beside her and said the word for the third time, but changed it. "They call her a gutter creature," the old housekeeper said loud enough for the front of the gallery to hear. "I dressed her for her first communion. There is no truer soul in this hall than the one they would not let through the door tonight." The third voicing. The label turned inside out by the one person present who had known Mirren before the world decided what she was. It carried farther than the old woman meant it to. It reached the floor, and the king, rising to announce a marriage the council had built for him, heard it. He stood at the foot of the throne, in the silence he was meant to fill with Coralie's name. He looked at the council. He looked at the earl's confident smile and at Coralie's white gown, and at the 700 faces, waiting for the order to reassert itself, and then he did the thing his father would never have done. He came down off the dais onto the marble floor where any man might stand, and he walked the length of the blue carpet in the wrong direction, toward the great doors, and he said to the chamberlain, in a voice that filled the hall, "Bring her in." The doors opened. Mirren stood in them in the ash-gray gown, summoned from the records room, with ink still on her fingers, having no idea what she had been called for, and 700 heads turned, and she did not bow. The king crossed to her. He stopped an arm's length away, exactly as he had on the night of the harvest moon, and the whole court strained to hear, and into the silence the candles made he spoke 6 words, "Marry me. I will not look away." Mirren did not move. Then, slowly, the old housekeeper in the gallery began to weep, and the sound of one woman weeping in a silent hall is a sound that breaks something open. The earl's smile fell off his face. Coralie's hand rose halfway to her mouth and stopped. And Lord Petrol, the keeper of the household, who had served the old king for 30 years and had ordered this same woman to kneel or be removed, stepped forward and struck his staff once upon the marble, and announced, in his trained and carrying voice, the king's betrothed, by her name and her father's name, Mirren of Estbury, daughter of Sir Edmund, before any lord in the room could draw the breath to object. The procedural seal, the thing the council could no longer undo, spoken aloud before 700 witnesses. The dowager of the council, an aged duchess who had ruled the old king's drawing rooms for 40 years and had expected to rule this one, opened her mouth and found she had nothing in it. Corley turned white and silver and walked from the hall, and the crowd let her pass, and many of them, the chronicles say, were already ashamed. Mirren looked up at the king who had asked her. 6 years and 1 kingdom too late? The question the old king never had. She did not say yes with her mouth. She lifted one ink-stained hand and laid it flat against his chest, over the breast pocket where the soft folded paper still lived. The dead widow he carried so as never to forget to look, and she felt the quick, uneven beating beneath it that matched her own. That was her answer. He covered her hand with his. The inquiry was finished by Christmas. 41 families had their land restored, the barley acres of Estbury among them, though Mirren never lived there again, for by then her home was elsewhere. The men with the neat signatures paid back what could be paid, and lost what could not be returned in coin, which was the court's good opinion. And the kingdom did not fall. And the council learned to advise rather than command, none of which is the image this story leaves you with. The image is a small one. The following spring, in a sitting room that had been the old king's cold, formal study, and was now something warmer, a fire burned in the grate. Rain moved against the tall windows in the soft gray way of the western vales. The room had changed by inches over the winter, the way a room changes when someone has begun to live in it rather than rule from it. A worn chair drawn close to the hearth, a basket of mending she did not need to do and did anyway because her hands had learned to be useful and would not unlearn it. A row of the reopened ledgers kept not as trophies, but as a promise to herself that she would not stop looking either. And on the mantel, where a king might have kept a sword or a seal, stood a single object Mirren had asked for, and the king had ridden 2 days personally to fetch from a yard at Estbury, where it had lain forgotten in a crate of her father's things. It was her mother's small enamel box, the one that had held the orchard seeds, the orchard her dead mother had planted, the orchard Mirren had thought she would never stand in again. She had planted new trees that spring on the palace grounds, with seeds from that box, and the king had knelt in the wet earth beside her, and dug with his own hands because kneeling, he had learned, was not the same as bowing, and a man could choose where he put his knees. She kept the box on the mantel where the firelight reached it. Some evenings the king would stand in the doorway of that warm room out of an old habit he had never quite broken, and she would look up from her work and say his name, and he would cross the threshold and sit, because she had taught him slowly that he was allowed. The old housekeeper from the gallery had a place in the household now by the heroine's own arrangement, and on the evening this story leaves them, she was in the room too, drowsing in the warm chair, and the kitchen boy who had spilled the coal carried in a fresh scuttle and was not afraid of anyone. These were the people Mirren had gathered to herself, not a court, a home. She had bowed to no one for 6 years. She had been right not to. And she never bowed again, not because she could not, but because the one man who might have asked it of her had learned, in a hall full of candles, to ask her instead, why? Thank you for staying to the end of Mirren's story. If the moment she would not bend stayed with you, leave a word below and tell me where you would have stood that night.